The answer to your first question, and I think a key flexibility that the governor's proposal affords the state is that ability to pay down the wall of debt, make payments to our pension funds above what we already owe, and then also to make infrastructure investments at the same time. We're also retiring debt. So we would be able to, in the same action, defease general obligation bonds that have been approved by the voters. And so that's really a key flexibility, I think, in the governor's proposal that is not available in ACA 4. And it does allow for some of that needed flexibility. In terms of the COLA question, I think that ACA 4, tried to, do some work about a workload budget and how much is, needed to fully fund a workload budget. These are very difficult and subjective analyses. And that was just something in the sake of complexity that we just didn't want to pursue. We were really trying to keep the mechanism more simple and understandable. And while that sounds simple in concept, the operationalizing of it can be complex. So it was not something that we did.
Well, Proposition 98 is also very complex, and I wonder what we're going to do when we no longer have the very few people that profess to understand it around to explain it. Thanks.
Thank you. We need to get on to our next panel, so thank you all very much. And there are still some outstanding questions, but I'll make sure I find you to get some answers after the fact. So moving on to our second panel, which is a multi-state perspective on budget reserve funds. We're going to ask Jonathan Griffin, who is the policy analyst with the National Conference of State Legislators, to join us, along with Mary Murphy, senior researcher at Pew Charitable Trust. Thanks for giving us your day today, for your patience with us. We're glad to have you. Mr. Griffin, we'll start with you.
For having me. As you said, my name is John Griffin. I'm with National Conference of State Legislatures in the Fiscal Affairs Division. So I'm just going to provide a brief recap of what states have done so far in the Rainy Day Fund department, and then turn it over to Mary and answer any questions you have. So reflecting each state's unique constitutional and statutory history, as well as their tax structure, budget stabilization funds have differed in design and purpose from state to state. Their underlying function, though, has remained the same. When capacity to generate revenue is strong, the state saves all or some of that surplus in a designated fund so that it can be used in later years when revenue generation is weak, thus the term rainy day fund. So currently, NCSL counts every state except for Colorado, Kansas, Montana, and New Mexico as having a rainy day fund. U.S. jurisdictions of Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and the District of Columbia now have funds as well. But every state, placing a precise definition of what a state's rainy day fund is not an easy task, since one state's definition of a stabilization fund is altogether different from another's. For example, Colorado, their required reserve, and New Mexico's restricted reserve, they're counted as rainy day funds by some public finance experts because they serve to help stabilize the general fund budget, even though NCSL does not consider those funds to be rainy day funds. State funds are usually created or are created either statutorily or via constitutional amendment. Some states maintain both a statutorily created fund and a constitutionally created rainy day fund. Sometimes states do this to they'll create an additional fund to house unexpected revenues. Alabama, for example, created a constitutional fund to house a one-time carve-out of oil and gas royalties. Alaska did the same thing to store a settlement award due to improper mineral extraction. Hawaii, Louisiana, Mississippi, some other states have also done or created funds to house these kind of one-time fees. States often use more than one budget stabilization fund because of the reliance on different sources of revenue. For example, personal income, corporate income, sales, and other taxes to fund services, and each of these revenue sources reacts differently to fluctuations in economic and business cycles. The 2003 report on rainy day funds, Brigham University professors Gary C. Cornea and Ray D. Nelson suggested that because state expenditure needs fluctuated with the same cycles, the use of multiple budget stabilization funds may more effectively address overall fluctuations in state budgets. So the purpose of my testimony is to discuss the legal mechanisms that go into creating a rainy day fund. Although these funds do differ in design and purpose from state to state, there are 4 common elements that govern most rainy day funds. There's a mechanism for depositing money into the account, a method for withdrawal when necessary, a provision for replenishing the fund once it's used, and a cap to keep the fund from being overfunded. My colleague, Mary Murphy, will spend more time on this, but in general, deposits come from either a line item appropriation in an annual or biennial budget, or from a portion of a fiscal year-end surplus. Some states' constitutional or statutory language prescribes what percentage of the surplus must be deposited into the budget stabilization fund. In some states like Arizona, Illinois, Michigan, and Washington, just to name a few, deposits are triggered when state revenues or economic growth exceed specific levels. Triggers vary in variety and complexity. In Indiana, for example, deposits are triggered when the annual growth rate in adjusted personal income exceeds 2%. In Idaho, by comparison, deposits are triggered when revenue growth exceeds the average growth rate over the last 6 years. So those are the basics of how states put money into the rainy day funds. Now I want to just shift the discussion to how states take that money out. Typically, withdrawals are made by approval of the legislature when revenues are insufficient to meet budget obligations. 17 states, though, this authorization for withdrawal only comes after a supermajority of the legislature approves the withdrawal. Kentucky and North Dakota actually skew the legislative process completely by giving their governors the authority to make transfers from the budget stabilization funds. Alternatively, some states have created automatic triggers for the withdrawals, so when an anticipated revenue or another economic indicator fall below specified levels, the money is automatically withdrawn. 15 states, as well as District of Columbia and the U.S. Virgin Islands, require the withdrawals to be repaid to their budget stabilization funds. Terms and conditions under where the withdrawals are repaid typically concern a due date for repayment or some sort of repayment schedule. Iowa and Mississippi, for example, withdrawals must be repaid to their funds by the end of the fiscal year in which the withdrawals occurred. But other states allow for repayment within 2 to 10 years of the day the withdrawals occurred. Like the deposit procedures, repayment procedures also vary in complexity. Florida and Missouri have specific schedules for repayment, whereas Minnesota allows repayments to be made only after a quote-unquote upturn in the state's economy. Finally, states consider, the final issue they consider when creating a rainy day fund is whether or not to cap the fund. 26 states are currently capping the size of their rainy day funds in relation to state general revenue fund, or in relation to state general fund revenues, while 13 do so in relation to the appropriation amounts. 8 states currently do have no limit on how much can be deposited into their fund. Budget experts and observers debate the amount states should accumulate in their budget stabilization funds. In the early 1980s, rating agencies recommended that states hold reserves of 3 to 5%. More recently, though, the Government Finance Officers Association suggested a reserve level of 15% or 2 months of general fund revenues. For individual states, however, appropriate reserve levels can vary. This is due in part to state-specific circumstances, such as the volatility of the state's revenue stream, or the availability of other funds to augment the general fund. So while rainy day funds played a role in helping legislators balance their budget throughout the last 2 recessions, the role they played was a secondary one. This partly has been due to a sense of uncertainty. As bad as things were, they might get worse. That has led states to preserve balances rather than exhaust them on an uncertain fiscal climate. However, the most important factor is that the majority of states' budget rainy day funds were not large enough to fill these gaps. For example, in fiscal year 2002, the median rainy day fund balance for the 50 states stood at $95.7 million, while the median budget gap was $394.8 million. The difference was even more pronounced during the most recent economic downturn. Now, in the 2010 fiscal year, the median rainy day fund was $105.7 million, and the median budget gap was $1.3 billion. These were not just isolated incidents. During both the recession of 2001 and the Great Recession, states faced budget gaps for at least 4 consecutive years. The implications of this mean that rainy day funds played a relatively small role in balancing most states' budgets because there was little money to use and the gaps were so large. Given the insufficiency of rainy day funds throughout the Great Recession, lawmakers have made numerous changes to rainy day funds in recent years. For example, Alabama repealed its statutory fund and then added a second fund to its constitution when voters approved it in November 2008. Utah, Vermont, and West Virginia also added new rainy day funds. Education-specific fund was added in Utah, whereas West Virginia made a one-time deposit of remaining money from its tobacco settlement and medical trust fund into a rainy day fund. Vermont's new fund works similar to their budget stabilization fund, but gives the state's General Assembly, rather than the state's Commissioner of Finance and Management, control over withdrawal from the money, or control over the withdrawal of money from the fund. States have also increased their cap size. Georgia, Oklahoma, and Virginia have all increased their caps to 15% from 10%, while Mississippi, Nevada, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and West Virginia increased capped amounts as well. Alternatively, North Dakota reduced their fund from 10% to 9.5%. 9 states have also altered their methods for withdrawal. Oklahoma changed their fund actually to allow the state to remove up to $10 million for providing incentives to support manufacturing establishments that are in danger of downsizing workers. Finally, Hawaii and Massachusetts changed their methods for deposit into their rainy day funds. Hawaii reduced the percentage of tobacco settlement monies deposited into the Emergency Budget Reserve Fund by reducing the fund, but also adding provision that the state must deposit 5% of the general fund balance at the close of each fiscal year, provided that general fund revenues from the previous 2 years have grown 5% successively. Massachusetts added a provision that 90% of their capital gains revenues in excess of $1 billion must be transferred to the state's budget stabilization fund. That's what I've got.
A lot of information. Thank you,
Just
Mr.
kind of
Griffin.
tried to get right through it there.
Well delivered. Ms. Murphy, welcome.
Welcome, thank you. Good afternoon, I'm Mary Murphy, as you said. I'm a senior researcher with the Pew Charitable Trust. We are an organization that's driven by the power of knowledge to solve today's most challenging problems. Pew applies a rigorous analytical approach to improve public policy, inform the public, and stimulate civic life. One focus of our work is helping states manage their long-term fiscal health by conducting research on common financial and economic challenges. So we work across the 50 states, highlighting solutions for lawmakers to consider and offering customized research and technical assistance. First, I just want to thank you for inviting me to this hearing. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some of our research findings on revenue volatility and best practices in rainy day fund design. So Pew focuses on volatility because it's one of the central challenges in state budgeting, influencing both the timing and size of budget surpluses and shortfalls. This is particularly important in California, which has above average revenue volatility compared to other states. Our research has identified steps states can take to better manage this volatility. For one, prioritizing saving in periods of growth can lessen the need for difficult choices like tax increases or service cuts in lean times. And with California now anticipating several years of significant revenue surpluses, this is an opportune time to consider changes to when, how, and how much the state saves in good times for use in bad times. As my colleague just mentioned, in his testimony, rainy day fund design includes a number of key elements, including setting the right target size for funds and establishing withdrawal rules that protect savings. These details ensure that resources are available to guard against the downs of the business cycle. And of course, it's also critical to provide the appropriate level of flexibility in the design of budget reserves. These administrative details, such as the timing of deposits, which we heard a little bit about in the last panel, are also important. So Pew's research has identified 3 best practices for establishing deposit mechanisms. First, we recommend that policymakers regularly study volatility to understand the fluctuations unique to their state's economy and revenue structure. Second, we recommend states use the results of this analysis to inform savings policies. So directly linking deposit mechanisms to volatility makes savings a consistent, predictable practice during times of growth. Third, Pew recommends state policymakers set explicit goals for funds. Establishing a clear purpose for your budget reserve allows you to work out the details and mechanics of saving to meet those goals and effectively manage volatility. So my remarks today will highlight rules that are already in place in some other states that may inform your consideration of both ACA 4 and the capital gains proposal set forth in the governor's budget. So first, to harness volatility and build savings at the right times, it's important to regularly examine and understand your state's unique patterns of volatility. And while the California LAO did an impressive comprehensive study in 2005, We recommend that states conduct this kind of study on a regular basis, since revenue volatility patterns and the underlying economic and policy conditions that drive that volatility do change over time. As an example, Utah conducts a volatility study every 3 years and incorporates the recommendations into its reserve fund policies. As Jonathan just mentioned, following recommendations from this analysis, Utah policymakers have increased the maximum balances of their 2 budget reserve funds twice since 2008. The second of the best practices that Pew identified is that states should design reserve funds that work to harness volatility in their tax collections. States should put aside money when they have money to save, namely during times of revenue growth. So as you know, as we've been discussing, both ACA 4 and Governor Brown's proposal would harness a portion of revenue growth for use in future downturns. And although they share this goal, the proposals function in very different ways. While both functions would connect savings to volatility in some way, which is a practice not commonly found across the states, I think you have a map in front of you that demonstrates 38 states do not consider volatility in connection to their reserve fund policies. Just 12 states tie the size and timing of deposits to volatility in their taxes or economies. So we found that in these dozen states, saving during good times is a consistent and predictable budget practice. I would, of course, like to note that California has already taken a modest step toward tying deposits to volatility. As we've mentioned, deposits to the Special Fund for Economic Uncertainties are based on year-end surpluses. And while this type of deposit rule is not uncommon, it's used by 19 states across the country, it does leave some room for improvement. So the deposit structure proposed in ACA 4 is one strategy that we've seen other states use in order to capture savings in years of unusually rapid growth. Along with other policy changes that we've discussed, it would link fund deposits to above-trend revenue growth, depositing money whenever total tax collections surpass that 20-year trend. So this rule is comparable in some ways to Virginia, which ties rainy day savings to the historical trend of the state's total general fund revenue. Virginia compares the prior year's growth to a 6-year trend, and 1/2 of revenues in excess of this trend are automatically set aside in its revenue stabilization fund. As a different example, Arizona links savings to total growth in a slightly different way. Instead of connecting deposits to above-trend growth in revenue, the state looks at above-trend economic growth to determine savings. And this is a rule that's worked well in Arizona because the state has revenue collections that track fairly closely with its volatile economy. But of course, many states have patterns of revenue volatility that are notably disconnected from economic fluctuations in both timing and magnitude. And so for this reason, a similar rule may not work in California in the same way that it's operated in Arizona. The strategy in Governor Brown's budget proposal links savings directly to a specific driver of revenue volatility, capital gains tax revenue. As we've heard earlier, capital gains revenue is expected to bring in about 10% of total general fund revenue in fiscal 2014, although it can fluctuate widely with the booms and busts of the stock market. In fact, as we heard from the LAO, swings in capital gains revenue drive much of the volatility in collections from the state's progressive personal income tax, the largest source of money for spending on state programs and services. So Pew's research has examined similar rules that are already in place in other states. In Massachusetts, the state takes capital gains taxes above a certain threshold and sets aside the excess in a rainy day fund. This policy allows the state to harness growth during spikes in capital gains, ensuring funds are available during downturns. Since the rule was implemented in fiscal 2010, the state's rainy day fund has more than doubled. The rule requires that all capital gains tax collections above $1 billion are deposited into the fund, and it annually adjusts that threshold upwards based on growth in nominal GDP. And we consider this detail to be a smart policy choice made with a longer time horizon in mind. Instead of focusing on capital gains revenue, both Louisiana and Texas connect their deposit rules to fluctuation and severance taxes, as these are major drivers of revenue volatility in those states. While both states set aside severance tax collections above a specific threshold, Texas's approach highlights the importance of periodically revisiting those benchmarks. Deposits to that state's rainy day fund are based on a 1987 benchmark, which has not changed since the fund's initial creation. The result of this fixed threshold is that the state transfers large sums into the fund but has less budgetary flexibility. Finally, our third recommendation is that all states, including California, should set clear goals for their reserve funds. Considering the purpose of the fund at the outset allows policymakers to make informed decisions about all aspects of rainy day fund policy design. This includes the appropriate level of savings needed to prepare for the next downturn, rules for withdrawing and using reserve money, and ensuring that deposits are made according to the adopted rules. So in conclusion, to design the most effective reserve funds for managing uncertainty, all states would benefit from, 1, regularly monitoring their sources and drivers of revenue volatility to ensure savings remain commensurate with their experiences. 2, putting in place policies that connect reserve deposits to that volatility. And 3, setting clear goals for reserve funds. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Murphy. Again, a lot of information.
We just gave you a lot of facts.
I'm just looking at your last 3 concluding bullet points. And the first one, regularly monitoring sources and drivers of revenue volatility to ensure savings remain commensurate with their experiences. Could I infer from that that a statutory budget reserve is probably wiser than a constitutional budget reserve? What good is the regular monitoring of sources and drivers of revenue volatility if our rules are locked into the Constitution?
Right. Well, I think that gets at some of the flexibility questions that were occurring in the last panel, and the specifics of how, of what aspects of the fund are written into the Constitution versus dealt with elsewhere, I think are questions that are specific to this legislature and to decisions made in the state. Because so many of our recommendations do ultimately hinge on making evidence-based policy that can be adjusted to remain commensurate with whatever volatility the state is experiencing, we would recommend that whatever set of policies the state ends up applying to its rainy day fund, that they are able to be adjusted appropriately so that the fund can continue to operate in accordance with its goals.
And Mr. Griffin, you had touched on different states having statutory, some constitutional, some having both, right, not unlike California. I suspect this is highly opinionated, but nonetheless, I'll throw it out there. It's quite possible that constitutional required budget reserves, well, at least here in California, given it has to go to the voters, may have some political overtone to it as opposed to just good, pure public policy. So could you even differentiate, and other states don't have the initiative process that we do, are there reasons why some of these states that have one or the other or both have decided to go in the direction they've gone in? Is it because they figured out that one is better than the other?
I'd have to go through each one to kind of come some sort of.
I know it's a very broad question.
First, as examples, though, sometimes, like we talked about with Alaska and Alabama, there are constitutional funds because there was this big lump of money and they wanted to let the voters kind of decide what to do with it. You'll see that sometimes, that the constitutional funds, kind of like you just alluded to, if it's an amount of money that can't be, or doesn't need to be changed, or there doesn't need to be a lot of control over its deposit, it can make more sense to allow the voters to do it. That's not always the case, but that certainly provides some of the examples that we've seen. And it would just really more, I would think, as you already said, is how much control the legislature wants over it. If it's something that they want the voters to approve and be set in stone, then it makes more sense for it to be constitutional. Not that constitutional changes can be made, but it's a lot more difficult, whereas statutorily provides greater flexibility.
Ms. Murphy, you had recounted the success of Massachusetts' budget reserve making use of capital gains. I don't know what percentage of their overall revenues capital gains represent, but it's been pointed out here in the first panel that our capital gains is, even at a high point, represent only 10% of our total revenue. Is it wise, and I think the LAO had expressed some opinion on this, do you think from your experience of reviewing all the many states that it's wise to have a 10% driver have full control of our decisions relative to spending and budget reserves?
So I think this actually gets back to that third recommendation from our research about establishing kind of clear goals at the outset about what you want your reserve fund to do, and then determining the other aspects of how you'll save, how much you'll save, what drivers of volatility you'll connect your deposits to, can all be driven by those goals that you set at the outset. I think in the last panel you talked a little bit about modeling and how would these rules have operated had they been in place. So if you go into some of those questions with a clear idea of what you would have wanted your reserve fund to be able to do, how much of a downturn you would have wanted to be able to guard against, I think that's one way to go about answering that question about whether tying to capital gains specifically, whether the 6.5% threshold, whether those numbers are all the kind of appropriate drivers for California.
And getting back to some comments and questions we made earlier, the tension between the need that the state has for its infrastructural, both human and brick and mortar, versus the need not to repeat what we've just gone through. If we were coming off, clearly your suggestion that we think of putting money aside in the good times is a good place to start. But we're coming off such bad times that it really leaves us at a really low base level of funding, both for education and for non-98 as well, which in some ways locks us into a relatively modest level of spending, whereas if we had some longer period of better times, and let's say we were at funding levels prior to 2008 and got further into this conversation, let's say looking back at Prop 58, which would have been 4 years old at that time, and saying let's make some improvements to it, and there hadn't been the fall of 2008, that we would be then creating this new reserve at a time of somewhat sufficient level of spending. That's not where we find ourselves now. Can you offer us any wisdom as to what to do about this tug of war here?
I mean, we're certainly sensitive to the fact that these are difficult choices, particularly coming out of a downturn as severe as the last one has been. And California and every other state has been through a series of really unenviable budget decisions. But I think the piece that our research speaks to is being careful to avoid linking what is either known or likely to be non-recurring revenue growth with those recurring spending needs. And I'm aware that even on the non-recurring side, that there are a lot of pressures in California about where to make those sort of one-time payments and how much of the projected surplus to set aside. I mean, I know those are difficult decisions. But I think given that we can identify some amount of this revenue growth as likely to be non-recurring, particularly when we're talking about spikes in sources like capital gains, that this is a really good opportunity to talk about how to smooth volatility over the future and prepare for future downturns so that cuts in the future are hopefully less painful.
Thank you. Senator Monning.
I want to add my thanks to both of you for joining us and the earlier panel as well. I want to kind of begin with a comment, but then a question. And the comments to kind of underscore what the chairs referred to and you've alluded to, the challenge we face coming out of deep recession, and by comparison, what we're able to invest in education, public education, safety net programs, and other measurements of the health of our state that we can't ignore for the purpose of just achieving a healthy reserve. So that's our challenge, I think, is how we balance those competing interests. It seems like in the governor's proposal, focusing on the use of capital gains revenues as a source of funding reserves, it's designed to reflect really our broader economy, because capital gains, I think, when there are more capital gains, there's probably more being generated in other revenue streams of personal income tax, corporate tax, and sales tax, because it reflects a healthier economy when you have higher capital gains revenues. But to try to find stability in your revenue source, isn't it better to diversify? What if a smaller percentage were taken out of all revenue sources coming to the state, so that in good times we'd be accessing maybe a smaller percentage, but from all four revenue sources that on aggregate might be more. And And then, so that's kind of question one. Question two goes to, I think you made reference to some states using mineral resource tax or mineral reserve tax. Is that the same as an oil severance tax? And how many states are using that as a means to fund reserves?
So to your second question, the examples that I noted in my testimony, let's see, we have Louisiana, Alaska, and Texas, I believe, are the states that really primarily use severance tax revenues because those are the drivers of volatility in those states' underlying revenue bases. But to your first question about kind of which approach is better, I think in our research we've seen that there's really sort of no one-size-fits-all approach to these kinds of questions, which is why our first recommendation is this one of performing this sort of regular and rigorous analysis of what's driving volatility in your state and figuring out which of these kinds of rules might work best in California. And as I mentioned, like in the state of Arizona, where they look at sort of a broader economic-based measure, that's worked well in that state. That may not necessarily translate to California's experience. Similarly, the Virginia model that looks a little bit more like ACA4, where they're looking at total revenue fluctuations over a historical trend, has worked pretty well there. But Massachusetts has also had a good experience linking to a very specific driver of volatility in their state. So I think that kind of brings us back to the what is going to be the best approach for California may look different from what's worked in other places.
And again, maybe this is too broad a conclusion to reach, but it seems our ability to be dynamic with changing circumstances, would you agree that would suggest against constitutional amendments that lock us into a particular formula and having more flexibility of statutory reform in this area?